And we have a question that came in, and Derek and Amy, maybe you can get ready and unmute Murray Ned's line. He's dialed in on the Zoom. Because this first question that I'm going to turn to came in just as we were getting ready to break for lunch. It's the third one in the queue here on your Slido. And I'm going to direct it to Murray. And it's because of the relationship between the Nooksack River and Fraser River, especially during flooding from meltwaters from Mount Baker. Is there any discussions among First Nations who live on the Nooksack with those on the Fraser? So Murray, if we've got you working here, I'll turn to you and see if you want to comment on that one. Okay, I'll just hold that one, and I'll turn to another question, and I'll just go to the one at the top of the queue here. So this one's for Bruce and Scott. You went through a number of acts, sections, tools, and provisions that the government has available. Of these, which do you think has the greatest potential for affecting change in the heart of the Fraser? So Bruce or Scott, whichever wants to go first, just wave your hand and we'll turn the floor to you.
I can take a crack at it.
All right, thanks, Scott.
This is sounds like a government answer, but like it really does depend, right? So what are we talking about in terms of change? And I heard, I was paying attention this morning to particularly Mike's presentation and Ryan's too, but and Murray and Ian's as well. So some of the big issues that we've talked about today are fisheries management issues for sure. The clearing on private land at Hurling Island, bank hardening, flood infrastructure, fish passage from Lena, riparian forest loss, and then the forested island loss, nutrient loading and temperatures, and then sediment distribution and movement. And so, I do think different tools are effective at addressing those issues differently, right? So establishing a WMA, for instance, for certain areas, maybe would address some of those things. Whereas, like I mentioned already, that some of the orders under the Land Act and maybe the ESA under the Fisheries Act would apply to others. And so I think that, again, my recommendation is to think through. So what are the values that we're managing for each one of those, and then how do we collectively, and particularly with First Nations, how do we start setting the objectives and then start managing towards them? There's going to be some things where it's really obvious. Okay, it just makes sense that we should, for this part of the river, we should establish a WMA. Everyone agrees that this is entirely appropriate. For other areas, it's we need to look at a land purchase initiative. But my sense is that there isn't one big clanging issue here that's standing out. It's a lot of cumulative issues, and it's going to require a sophisticated approach to addressing. So yeah, I know it's not a simple answer to a fairly straightforward question, but that's where I land.
All right, well, thank you for that, Scott. It's certainly, I think, helpful to understand that perspective. Bruce, do you want to add to that?
Sure, I can try. I would. I think Scott's right on all counts. It's going to depend very much on the circumstance. But the thought that came to me while I was listening to the speakers this morning, and then Scott this afternoon, was that we need to be addressing these issues at very large scales as well as at the small scales. And that's part of, I think, Scott's point, that it really depends. Because from what I was hearing from Ryan, from Murray, from others, that was that if you put a wall around the heart of the Fraser, it's not going to be okay. That's not enough to make sure it's going to be okay, because the conditions in the heart of the Fraser are being established by inputs from upstream, timing and volumes of flow, and the functioning or discharge of those volumes of flow, and at different times with their sediment and the living species within it, within a floodplain that's highly modified, by human activities. And so unless we are sharper at defining what the threats are and what the action is that can address that threat, so that we provide long-term actual conservation as opposed to just protection, but sort of meaningful change, I think it really has to be sharpened to a particular threat so that we can put the right tool on it. If that turns out to be an ESA, so be it. If that turns out to be cumulative effects assessments based on regional assessments as part of Fisheries Act reviews, great. If that's changed as to other levels of government's legislation in order to reestablish things like natural hydrographs, fantastic. They're all for a different circumstance. I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I think those were thoughtful responses from both Bruce and Scott. But I'm going to take host prerogative and probe this a little bit further with both of you before I turn to our panel to see if any of them would like to comment further. And appreciating what you're both saying, the way I heard it is there's no one broad sweeping thing. You really need to think about the right tool for the right problem and put them all together to steer towards the outcome you want. Those are my words summarizing what you guys said. But just to probe this a bit further, and Bruce, I'll start with you and then turn back to Scott. Out of the tools that are in your toolbox, are there some that you think are underutilized, not utilized to their best extent, or perhaps more applicable, and maybe where a group would be best advised to put their energy out of the tools that you have at your disposal within the DFO toolbox? Is there anything that stands out, recognizing the breadth of your previous answer?
Yes, that's a tough one. I think that what stands out is the opportunity for us to set and conduct ourselves based on priorities. And it doesn't matter if we are putting a call for proposals out for restoration funding or planning activities, or whether we are deciding where an ecologically significant area might be established, or if we're working on best management practices with BC or national codes of practice. I don't think we're going to we will never have the capacity to do the level of activity everywhere at the same time that would probably be to the benefit of fish and habitat. And so our need, I think, is to set priorities that can be activated with all of our tools. I think we could work collectively to establish priorities for things like our grants and contributions funding, so that we were putting those very much to needs-based and outcome-based project opportunities. But that's not to infer that we need a top-down government approach. I think that Murray and Ian this morning talked about how work had been done with local communities to identify priorities within a larger area. I think if we were to do that in a structured way across the region, identifying what our values were, identifying what our priorities were, all doing that in a similar fashion, and then prioritizing, I think we'd make the biggest possible difference. And I think that if you started today convening a group that was really that was broadly representative in order to set conservation strategies, you would have started down the path towards better outcomes for Fisheries Act decisions, specifically around harm to habitat, harm to fish, and whether we establish an ESA, because you'd be starting to sharpen the connections and where you want us to exercise our priorities. Sorry, trying to speak to what I think is the most constructive use of people's time, and it's sharpening those principles and priorities.
So you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong or off base or misrepresenting, but the priorities and the objectives are more important a focus, in your opinion, than the activation of the tools?
Yes, because if you, in the absence of that, you've got a tool with a framework that says to consider a number of things, but it's only as smart as you put the details behind it. What are you trying to achieve in a particular circumstance? Is that supported broadly? And so you can expect to see the same thing happening everywhere? Or is it only based on the site-specific details? And you'll never really see that common thread you're seeking. I think the more we can organize ourselves around those core objectives and outcomes that we anticipate, then you'll start to see alignment and improvement.
All right. Well, thanks, and thanks for allowing that follow-up. Scott, I'll just turn to you on the same follow-up. Is there anything that stands out, recognizing your previous answer, that you would say is underutilized or would be perhaps a target for entities to advocate for, to support, to inform in terms of your sense of the provincial toolbox?
Those reserves under the Land Act are, I guess I was surprised a few years ago when we implemented one for float homes in the lower river. And like I wasn't very familiar with the Land Act as I moved into this role, and saw that my executive director was basically saying no more new float homes tenures in the lower Fraser, because, and there are good reasons for that, mainly because we couldn't integrate very well with communities and local governments and so on. But it was her decision to do that, and it was implemented, and that's it. No one applies anymore. And it affects not just Land Act decisions, but it also impacts WSA decisions. So I do think those reserves as a tool, as a regulatory tool, are extremely powerful and maybe not well understood. And we've been doing some work to kind of clean up some of our reserves, because, and I could give you other examples. We have a reserve on a watershed in the South Coast here that was put on by a fisheries biologist several years ago, convinced somebody at Lands to implement this. And every year, during sort of the height of the clean energy gold rush, if you want to say it, I would get a call from a proponent, a project proponent, asking, because we had this reserve in place, they had to contact me and ask whether or not they could make application for a water license on the stream that we had Summer Rent Steelhead in. And every year I'd say no, that the issues here are too significant. And I just couldn't believe it. I'd never seen us be able to be so proactive in and relatively easily in setting some restrictions. So if I had to pick one thing, one tool that is just relatively straightforward for us to implement, there are some elements, uh, some conditions that we need to meet before we can implement those reserves. But I do think there's some opportunities to kind of as a stopgap for us. And again, I don't want to take away from anything I just said in suggesting that, but if you're going to press me, I think it's a tool that could be better taken advantage of.
Well, I was doing my best, Peter Mansbridge, to kind of politely press you while not having you just abruptly sign off. So thanks for that.
Good job.
I'll just turn to the other panelists here. Lena or Les, would you like to offer any comment or perspective on this particular thread of question or discussion?
Well, I mean, again, in many years of we try to do various levels of reserves, whether it was along the Fraser or along the coast, it's the length of process and the type of reserve. And Scott, I got to give you credit. I mean, you guys have done some good time with the Crown Land Securement Program or Reserve Program and things like that. But some years we've been really successful, and then there are years when we weren't able to achieve anything. And in fact, was it in the North Coast or Upper Mid Coast when we had a bunch of reserves taken off because of the various industrial development that's being proposed and are going forward. So, I mean, obviously there's a risk with the lower level of protection. So my concern is what can we do? And that's why I got so involved with this Indigenous conservation side, because I see that you guys have to go through sort of referral process with First Nation communities. And so what they're saying is, okay, we need to be able to make comments and get back to you guys. Why don't you give us the tools to be able to reserve and put our level of reservation on these areas and having the provincial support? I know there's a question there on the list there that says, or is there legal protection for IPCAs or other levels of protection? And in Northwest Territories and the Yukon, there are. If they designate an area as an proposed IPCA, the Yukon or the Northwest Territories government signs off on them due to devolution, the feds have stepped out. In BC, everybody that I've talked to, nobody within the province, nobody's willing to move that forward. So I'm having some discussion with Murray Rankin, the minister, and I've had some discussions with some of the directors in environment so far, and trying to talk as to what kind of designation or what kind of overlapping legal definition the province could possibly put on these proposed IPCAs to make it a legit, legally accepted conservation area. And the best one I can come up with is, even if the province is willing to, there's one thing that you did not have in there was conservancies. And I know that's, again, a lower level of protection by the province, but it does have co-management and has all that component in it. So that might work in BC. So sorry, it's a long thing, but those are the kind of things that went through my brain when you guys were talking.
Well, thanks, Les. Lena, when I was asking about follow-up on that, it looked like you were shaking your head. I'll just double check. Would you like to comment on this one at all?
Just very briefly, I guess. I think everyone's made some good points, but I was thinking more about what Bruce was saying about objectives and priorities, and I think this venue could be, and I hope people are responding to that question that through their Slido. But I was just thinking, we've already identified the heart of the Fraser for a number of reasons that have been discussed at length this morning, and I'm wondering how much more we need to do, like what level of priority, like how do we start prioritizing this area? Is it going to be at the sub-reach base? Are we looking at specific species? Could we say pink spawn in the main stem of the Fraser River, of the gravel reach, therefore that area should be protected? Like, what are we looking at here? Sorry, it's more a question than a comment.
I could certainly turn that back to our speakers and see if you have a comment on it. Or, Alina, if there aren't comments, I think that's one we could certainly take away, and that can become part of what do we do about that. So I see Les and Bruce were both signaling a thought there. So Les, you go first, and then I'll come to Bruce.
Oh, thank you. It'll be really quick. I mean, what really concerns me, I understand the Lower Fraser, but you can't affect the Lower Fraser without working on the Upper Fraser and the overall piece, which I said in my talk. What concerns me is once we start breaking into very specific habitat types, like you're saying pinks, or are we talking about some other species? If we're talking very specific species management, to me, that's where we start failing, because you could be improving for one species and degrading for another one. So now I would caution, and for 30 some odd years, I stayed away from species specific management initiatives and supporting those, because they always, to me, seem to fail.
Thanks, Les. Bruce, do you want to offer a comment there?
Sure, it might be inadvisable, but I will. Lena, I think there's two ends of that spectrum. I think at the highest level, with what kind of objectives that we're setting out to achieve, perhaps we're there. But at that highest level, I think the most meaningful action is convening a broadly representative group of stakeholders and all the authority holders, and getting endorsement that adherence to some broadly agreed principles for the benefit of fish habitat, ecosystem, wildlife is supported and endorsed. And it goes to Scott's point of, is this something that the Indigenous groups in that area see as something of merit that should be advanced on a timeline? We know reconciliation will take a very long time, and we want to be very mindful of that dialogue. We want to achieve timely improvement of outcomes for species, but that has to be advanced in a way that's mindful and respectful of all of our growing awareness and efforts towards reconciliation. And so I go to Scott's comment that unless at the outset there is support broadly around articulating objectives and principles and aligning our individual decisions towards those from the broadly representative group of authority holders, I don't think it's going to matter what one group like what DFO says. That concerns me at the top level, and I think that's where I guess I'd recommend effort go at the top level. I'm kind of rehashing Les's answer, and at the bottom level, when it comes down to single species, if you've identified an area, for example, that has to that warrants a increased oversight or management, and we're setting conservation objectives, then if you're your first stop, I would suggest, is setting biophysical principles. So what are the inputs and outputs that are necessary to support an ecosystem? But if you're past that gate, then eventually you will end up setting goals and objectives around individual species. But I'd suggest that's a triage depending on circumstance of whether you believe that your conservation objectives are going to be met by larger physical process, whether things are dire enough that you're trying to set species by species. But I would echo Les's caution on that one, because single species by species management is never advisable. So I see those two as the granular is when your concerns are granular. If you want the broadest possible change of setting priorities, I think it's more about consensus at that level and not so much about the detail of the priorities, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, thanks. That was a good discussion on that thread. And Les, I think you probably covered off that second question in our Slido as well, at least in terms of the BC context. So we'll clear that one off. Justine, I'm going to come to you to let you pick the next question in just a second. I'm just going to see, Derek, if we can check and see if Murray Ned's line will open up here, because if it will, we'll come to him for the question on the top of the Slido list right now. So Murray, if you're online and you can hear us, we're just sending you a little ping asking you to go into Zoom and unmute yourself. And that should let you come live on your telephone and talk about that question. Looks like it might be working. Are you on, Murray?
Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Oh,
Jason?
sorry, Murray, if you're there, just say hello so I know you can hear me.
I am saying hello, Jason.
Can you hear me?
No.
Can you hear me?
No, Jason can't hear me.
Oh,
Try again, Murray?
I'm here. Are you?
oh, there he is. It might just be me and my not knowing how to use an earpiece. Hey, Murray, thanks for signing into this one. And so I'm going to go to the first question there on the top of our Zoom. Because of the relationship between the Nooksack River and the Fraser River, especially during the flooding from meltwaters at Mount Baker, is there any discussion among First Nations who live on the Nooksack with those on the Fraser?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. It's a bit of a loaded question. I'll try and be succinct about it. And it's one of jurisdiction and perhaps practicality. And from a jurisdictional perspective, the fish don't know any borders. The water doesn't know any borders. And so with the Nooksack River flooding, it quite often is the trigger for, the Samath Lake returning or the lake water returning in the Fraser Valley. But there is not a current formal process between Samath First Nation and Nooksack, but there should be, because historically we were pretty close as two tribes, and we shared the resources of the Samath Lake. We call it the Samath Hatsa, that's lake in Halkamalam in the past. And so, because the border has divided us, it's also divided the opportunity to engage regularly. But if I think about jurisdictions, we've got the city of Abbotsford, and then we've got the province and Sumas that have a formal MOU in place to deal with flood mitigation and bank stabilization. And so during that whole 2021 flood event, there was opportunity to engage at that scale, but never did we engage at the nation to nation or tribe to tribe scale. And that's something our leadership will follow up with. And so both for human safety and infrastructure integrity, but also for the fish, and also for, there's probably a lot of water quality testing that needed to occur. So it will be work in progress as we debrief amongst ourselves at the nation scale, but also as we debrief with government and stakeholders in local jurisdictions. Hopefully that answers some of the question.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Murray, and thanks for signing on the Zoom to answer that one for us and staying with us all day. That just kind of does make me wonder whether there is any parallel kind of connection with the government entities or even the non-government entities in the same area. So, I'll just put that to the panel to see if anybody in their non-government or government seat can comment on whether there's collaboration in that corridor with your corresponding jurisdiction across the border, at least that you're aware of. I know it might not be solely your responsibility in a place like the federal or provincial government, but I just check that.
We do have some transboundary committees dealing with, there is a Nooksack River Management Committee that it's actually the Ministry of Environment sort of lead those conversations. And the focus, as I understand, is largely around water quality issues. But I would say our group in particular, it's been a long time since we've met with our counterparts on the US side of the border. Usually those conversations are focused on specific issues. For my team, it would be a species at risk or something that we want to kind of compare notes on.
Bruce, do you have any comment on that from a DFO perspective?
A whole of department response is a tough one here because
Fair enough.
my engagement transboundary has been around aquatic invasive species with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. So there are certainly operational discussions on some topics, and then there's formal points of contact on some of the issues like salmon treaties. But operational coordination on the topics we're talking about today in the gravel reach of the Fraser, I'm not aware of any transboundary work. I expect if you spoke to our species at risk side of the shop and fisheries management, that you would find that they do have some transboundary coordination.
Yeah, and I could say from the Pacific Salmon Foundation side, we definitely have some relationships with entities from the state side, but not specifically in that Nooksack corridor in particular. So certainly not a place that we've got deep connections from our side. Lena or Les, did you want to comment on that before I turn it to Justine to pick a question? No? Okay.
Oh,
sorry,
sure.
Lena, go
I
ahead.
could say, yeah, no worries. Not specifically with Nooksack watershed either. However, we do have some very good relationships with the Nature Conservancy and the Floodplains by Design collaborative group down in Washington State. There's been a lot of conversations with staff, even at the county level, who are putting into place like educational initiatives, as well as working with engineering and planning staff on fish-friendly flood works, like coordinating and collaborating with tribes and farmers and fishers in there. So we definitely are learning a lot from what's going on in Washington State and looking at what would make sense in a Canadian, British Columbian context.
Okay, well, thank you, Lena. Justine, I'll turn it over to you to pick another question, but just before I do, I'll prompt people to feel free to continue to load your questions into the Slido. And I will say that if anybody from, I'll call the workshop organizing team wants to make a comment and wants us to open your mic for you, just use the raise hand function on Zoom, and I think I'll be able to see that, and we'll make sure we make a place in the queue for you. So Justine, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Jason. So many of the speakers point to the need for a collaboratively developed plan or objectives that each decision-making group can point to when they say yes or no. How could we do this in a way that decision makers can stand behind the plan or the objectives. That's not directed to anyone specifically, so anyone who'd like to jump in and attempt to answer that. Bruce.
Sure, I can take a stab at it, but I think Scott's probably coming with deeper wells of experience. But um, yeah, sorry, you took the question down. But in terms of how to make it do it in a way that decision makers can stand behind it, maybe in court. Maybe in court is the really critical aspect there. You would have heard from Scott and from me that our authorities come from very specific pieces of legislation. And so whether that specific piece of legislation applies to a particular situation on the ground is going to depend on the particulars. But if you, for example, is it on land or is it in water? But so I think if you, as part of a planning table or decision-making group, if you created a model of what your objectives were and of your legal authorities that were going to be put in place by the various agencies and levels of government in order to support those goals and objectives, then you would have a very direct way of identifying in circumstances or locations what your legislative authority would be that would be relied upon in order to support the conservation objective or action. I hope that made sense. It's about mapping the values you're trying to maintain and the actions that threaten those against the legal authority, so that you know in any given situation which ones you're drawing on or which ones the group can just organize themselves around. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruce. Anyone else have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I'll take a crack at it too. So I'll just add to Bruce's. So like I would say, first of all, in our field of work, like in the realm of conservation and habitat protection, and I worked the first 12 years of my career, so I was a habitat protection officer, basically reacting to proposals and saying no. You develop a very jaded view of the world because everything you go and look at is slated for some form of impact or destruction. And so you start seeing that the whole world is being destroyed. And one of the things I observed through that process was that when we did set objectives, when we did say what we wanted and we were proactive about it, it was a game changer. And so if you think about it in terms of like from a legal perspective, if you start with like say a low level legal objective, like Scott thinks that we should have 50-meter wide setbacks in the Kanaka Creek watershed, and I provide that up front and so on, to developers and to the municipality. That did actually carry some weight, right? So um, and that's an exaggeration, but the ministry is saying, look, we're trying to achieve this level of, say, riparian conservation within this area. It would be accounted for in the decision. The decision maker would be forced to put their mind to that. And I guess I'm contrasting that with a developer or a proponent coming forward with a proposal and us not being able to contextualize that decision other than to say we don't like it, right? We don't like this. We've seen enough bank hardening on the river, and we're going to say no to you. And they may say, well, why us? Like, why are you saying no now? You've allowed X amount. What's a little bit more, right? And it is a very difficult place to be in if you don't have some form of objective. Anyway, but going back to my point about sort of that level of sort of legality of the objective, right up to the point where it's set in stone through some type of land use order or something that has been established in collaboration with, and everybody agrees, or maybe the extreme, it's now a park, right? But there's a gradient there, and I would say the legal standing depends on where you are on that gradient, but it's always useful. Like it's always powerful. Give you one more example. We actually had a proposal. You guys maybe could figure out where it is, but where we were having a development that was going to impact on the river and was actually going to be partially like in the river. And we were talking about like and unfortunately, we were in reactive mode. We didn't like the proposal that they'd come up with some habitat mitigation and so on. We just didn't feel like it was going to satisfy the impacts, and we went to our lawyers and said, "What if we had come up with an objective ahead of time and said we don't want the river to get smaller, like we just and the it seems like a ridiculous thing. Like we should already have that as an objective. Like it's implicit that this is a valuable asset and resource, but we haven't actually, in some cases, we haven't written that stuff down. We haven't laid out what our objectives are. Anyway, we proposed that to our lawyers and said, like, what if we had done this just hypothetically, because we were in a tough spot legally because of where we were in the process. And their answer was actually that would help, right? It would help if you had communicated that up front, and everybody was awake to it, regardless of where it came from and what its legal status was. If we had communicated that objective, then it would have equipped the decision maker, and frankly, the proponent would have been better informed about that objective. Even though maybe we would think they should already know that. If we don't put these things down, if we don't make it clear, there's always the excuse that people are not clear on what we're trying to achieve.
Okay, so it really goes back to that being really explicit about what the objectives are, even if we think they're obvious. I guess the question is that what does that look like to get to that point? Like, is that a group like this coming together to present that? Does that have to come from First Nations? How do you get to that point?
Yeah, well, so my view on that is, we've developed a number of these SBOTs for different values in the region. And I would say that there has been a concern about us using the word objectives, because it does have legal ramifications. And what we have found is the antidote to that issue is transparency. Just say where we got the objective from. This is Jason's objective for the river. And, we just say that, right? This is what Jason wants to see on the river, and we communicate it up front. And where did that come from? Well, Jason thinks this is what we should do for the river. And we can account for that in our tools. And again, I'm using an extreme but this group could come up with a set of objectives, and that information could be helpful. It could be useful in the hands of statutory decision makers. They'll have an understanding of, like, there's a significant group of people who've come together with representation from a number of different perspectives, and they're saying that this is what they want to see on the river. Now, there may be other perspectives, of course, but you get the point, right? And there's nothing stopping us from starting down that path. And we just need to be honest about where it comes from and what it's based on.
Great. And did anyone else have anything else I'd like to add to that question, Lena or Les? Or back to you, Bruce, if you'd like.
Sure.
Well, Justine, I'd like to comment on that if I can. I'll take my facilitator hat off for a minute, but I will put this out, and I would welcome response or perspective on this, but I'm not actually targeting it at any particular individual on the panel here today. But I would say, when I'm trying to match what we heard this morning with where we're at and what we have at our disposal in the toolbox this afternoon. And at least to my thinking, what I heard this morning is it's an important area. It's got, the ecological values are very, very high, and without question, there's no debate about that. The area has already had a significant amount of development historically that has negatively affected cumulatively over time the values in the area. That the way we're developing, have developed in the past, and at least at present continue to develop, is not sustainable ecologically, and it's also not particularly viable even from a land development, water use, flood management perspective. And so when I put all that together, I think, how can we not be in a place where the path forward needs to be the status quo doesn't work, and every single switch that you can turn needs to be turned in a way that does things better. So every federal decision, every federal policy, every federal preference should be turned to do things better. And the same provincially, and the same for nations, and frankly, the same for non-government organizations and communities and local governments. And I have the view that somehow collectively we're stuck. And I don't know if it's because we're waiting for someone else to make the first move, whether it's politically inconvenient, whether the toolboxes just are not suitable, or whether it's a mix of all those things or something else. But I am having some trouble bringing together the morning conversation of high value, significant development pressure and serious ongoing risk with this afternoon session around, so what are we going to do about it? And I think I'll just mark that as a comment, but if anybody would like to provide a response or a rebuttal to that, I'd welcome it.
I think Les was going to say something. Les, did you want to jump in? Or?
Sure. I mean, again, going back to my history with working in BC, we're planning nature to death. It's action that speaks. So, I mean, to me, I've always believed in form the partnership, have the right group of people, First Nation, Fed, provincial, NGOs at the table, whomever, and for us to put together a plan and deliver it to be successful. So to me, it's action oriented. Like these are great discussions and great pieces that I've seen in the presentation. But how do we make it? How do we do it? How do we get it done on the ground? Is always been my objective. And then at the same time, a partnership like that could also garner political support on the federal level, on the provincial level, and et cetera. Like I'm talking about the SG program. I'm talking about a bunch of other partnerships that we led that was extremely successful while it was in place, and then it kind of dissipated or dissolved. But this, I see that such an important piece that it needs that to happen, and PSF or whomever wants to take the lead is to bring people to the table and having a really objective setting discussion and move forward. So to me, I've always used a very good friend of mine's quote saying, as I said at the beginning, we're planning nature to death. We need to act. So that's all I have to say.
Bruce.
I feel gaps, so I'm going to do that now. I don't want to belabor the point, but I have to, I'll just share that I have been involved in a lot of discussions around planning and resource management. And just as a lot of our work is reviewing projects and reacting, I find that when we go out, we elicit responses. And who's leading is often as important to whether you can move an initiative forward and have a positive outcome than is the weight of the ideas behind the initiative. And in almost any discussion I've had internally or externally regarding these kinds of broadly applied decisions, the first questions that have been coming up have been, what do the Indigenous communities think? What do the other levels of government think? And when we talk to those other levels of government or the Indigenous communities, and I apologize if I'm going off script, is, well, we'd like to engage, but we need resources to engage. And so you end up with a lot of people with really good intentions that for some reason or another are reacting to the presentation or the presenter as opposed to the initiative or the idea. And to get started, I think it really goes to what Les said. I think everybody needs to take a little bit of a risk and come together as a group and evaluate whether there are gaps in the representativeness of that group and whether there is some common ground where we can start to identify values and objectives and what our thresholds are that we're going to try to achieve and continue to expand our group. If you want something out of the gate that would say BC will deliver all of its laws and jurisdictional authorities to achieve this outcome and Canada will do the same, you're going to need to talk to elected officials. If you want to talk to people who have delegated decision-making authority to make better outcomes for the values that are out there on the landscape, you can sit down. It's getting late today. You could sit down tomorrow with people and start conversations if towards a broadly representative, collaborative group. Levels of approval are about what you're asking for from it. The risk and start, I'd say, is talking.
So really that need to sit down and figure out what the wants are. And I echo what Les is saying. We don't want to plan it to death, but we also do need to have some of that planning and writing down of what the objectives are. So it's balancing act there. Does anyone else have anything else they'd like to add on this topic, or we'll move on to the next question? Okay. So we're going to take a little bit of a turn here, and this question was specifically for Scott. So mineral tenures surrounded in ecologically sensitive Skagit River Donut Hole area recently was surrendered in ecologically sensitive Skagit River Donut Hole area recently with significant compensation to Crown land tenure holders. Is that a precedent for other Crown land or First Nations land?
Well, so that specific decision isn't a precedent, but yes, there is precedent for, particularly for mineral rights, right? So if we are, if we're asking a tenure holder to surrender their mineral rights, then they're going to be compensated generally. That's true. I'm trying to think of what the parallel would be in it. I guess, like I'm thinking, well, if we were to establish, for instance, a WMA and we had areas that we wanted to include in the WMA that were privately held, or we were impacting on other Crown land rights associated with that, then yeah, we would have to kind of weigh that as to whether or not that land needs to be purchased or if there is some other compensation.
Thank you, Scott. Did anyone else want to add anything on that topic? Nothing. And
pretty exciting
I'm
decision
seeing
there.
Definitely. I'm seeing also something here from Troy possibly speaking. Jason, did you want to talk to that one?
Sure, Justine, thanks. If you've seen me looking away from the screen, I've just been doing a little bit of checking with people who were putting questions in on the Slido. And we have one up here from Troy Nelson. It's the middle one in the Slido queue. So Derek and Amy, if you could find Troy Nelson in our Zoom queue and send him the invite to unmute. I think I saw him there. Yeah, Troy, you should be getting a ping asking you to unmute. And if you can just do a sound check, see if we can hear you. Troy?
Testing.
Perfect.
From Australia.
Oh, wow. Well, welcome from Australia. And thanks for joining us. And Troy, I'll turn it over to you because I think your point was more of a comment than a question. So I'll give you the floor here.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And happy Australia Day, everybody. 26th of January here already. My point basically is that, the Fraser watershed is an entire watershed, and the heart of the Fraser is a pinch point that's so important ecologically, environmentally, but it is only as healthy as everything that feeds it. And for salmon and other species, including sturgeon, they go both ways through that pump, which is the heart. So just as this is more speaking to the agenda and the last group discussion question on moving forward, I think it's really important to consider, applied efforts within future program information, distribution, participation, dispersal, of information. People, First Nations communities, NGOs, groups throughout the entire watershed. And that's probably something you guys are probably considered or are doing in some degree. But full court press to do that, because the success of the Heart of the Fraser will be dependent upon the success of the populations of fish and the ecology, the environment, habitat in those tributaries, including the extremes of all the upper tributaries. In my mind, I see the Fraser River as to be the Nechako River. I see it to be the Thompson River. I don't view the confluence at Prince George as being the place where the Nechako enters the Fraser. I see that as the river is the Nechako. The Fraser River is the Stewart. It is the Thompson. It is the Nicola. It's the culmination of all that. And of course, the Heart of the Fraser has to have all of those good and potentially harmful things passing through it. Those things being the effects of decision makers and others. So it's just a suggestion. A watershed plan that includes all species and all communities for the future would do a world of good for the goals and objectives of the Heart of the Fraser program. That's pretty much all I had to add. Thanks.
Well, Troy, thank you for offering that. I would say that I think the way I heard your point and your summary there really aligns with, I think, what Les was saying, what Bruce has been saying, what Scott's been saying. We've heard that. We heard that this morning from Ryan. That I think Bruce's words that stuck with me were, even if you put a wall around the Heart of the Fraser, it doesn't mean the Heart of the Fraser area is going to be okay. Bruce said something to that effect, I think. And I think Troy, the point you've made is along those same lines. So it's very consistent with some of the other bigger ideas that we've heard today. I don't think I do have some Zoom questions from this morning that I think most of them were around Ryan Bradley's talk. So we're just checking to see if he's online and can join and take a couple of these, because we've got about 5 minutes left here. We do have one Zoom comment that was put up by Rob. It's the second one on our list here right now. And I'll just maybe check and see, Scott, Bruce, are you aware of this this report that Rob has posted? He's put a link here in the Slido comment. And again, don't worry if you haven't recorded it all or whatever. We'll have this for after. But are you aware of this, and is it part of what you think about in terms of your work in this area?
Yes, I believe so, and because we've been building off that, I think with working with Scott's ministry on other map reserves related to the Fraser River Estuary Management Plan era compensation sites, and as part of a larger mapping effort of compensation sites in the Lower Fraser. So, yeah, we are aware of it.
Okay. Scott, did you have any other comment on that?
No, I'm not specifically familiar with that report, but my staff are saying, yeah, we're connecting and we're looking to see if we can integrate some of that information into our tool as well.
Okay. Well, Rob, thanks for putting that up, and thanks, Bruce and Scott. And we're getting near the end. So, Justine, I didn't kind of bounce this off you, but I grabbed a couple of questions that came in just after Ryan's talk from this morning, and I think we've got them unmuted here. So, Ryan, there's two that I think are related to your talk, the second and third one on our Slido list. Who used to collect this sediment budget data, and why did it stop in 2000? And then the second one was, other studies determined 1 million cubic meters of new gravel were coming into this area, but someone, I think it was you, said it's now 200,000. So where's the paper that is determining that? So I'll turn it over to you, Ryan.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So the first one is a good question, and it's a bit of a bummer answer. So Water Survey of Canada did incredible sediment sampling in the 60s and the 70s, and it was amazing. A lot of it was done, they tried to do it throughout the whole river, but a lot of it was done at Mission. And that actually was quite useful for working with the sediment budget. But the funding was cut at the end of the day, and then there was no more Water Survey of Canada sediment sampling, which means that we actually don't have any, government sediment sampling of the Fraser River, at least to the extent where we could really start developing a sediment budget based on the input data. And a lot of that is just at Mission. It gets even a bit more all over the place when you go upstream of there. So that's the answer to that. In terms of what data were available for developing a sediment budget, there was some work by SFU in the early 2010s to get that sediment budget or sediment monitoring going. But the nature of that is, the research stopped and the student left, and with that information has not gone ongoing. So we have a little bit of information for about 3 or 4 years in the early 2010s on sediment coming in. And then in terms of why did it stop in 2000? So the sediment budget for the gravel bed reach was not actually based on any sediment input data that was collected. It was inferred from changes in air photos and a little bit of bathymetric measuring. So it stopped in 2000 again because that research basically died with that research program. I think a lot of it back then, this predates me, but I think a lot of it was driven by the idea to figure out a reasonable scientific-based volume of sediment that could be removed for gravel mining. And ultimately, the gravel mining stopped in the gravel bedded reach. So with that, the sediment budget work kind of stopped through there. So that's the second question. And then the third question, I'm not quite sure. I went back because I saw that question pop up this morning and went back to double check everything, and I still get 200,000 as a number. So that's gravel coming into the gravel bedded reach. Sand is on the order of about 6 cubic meters or something like that. Of course, these values vary dramatically with flows and also years of flows. So we've had quite a few low flow freshet years. So the idea is, we think from some of the bathymetry that we have, is there may be a bit of a buildup of sediment, of sand at least, around Mission. That's where a lot of the actual data I have that's coming in now is around there. I don't know what's going on in the gravel bed reach, but there's been a buildup, and the idea is probably with a big flood, we would see a lot of sediment move again. But that's just kind of working hypothesis, because we just don't have that information. And I can send that paper if someone wants to shoot me an email. It's based on all of the stuff out of UBC from Mike Church, those numbers.
Okay, I can't recall, or it might have been an anonymous post, but if you want to follow up with Ryan on that, you can find his coordinates on Google. That's how I found him. But if not, you're welcome to contact me at Pacific Salmon Foundation, and I'll connect you or get you that paper. So we're nearing the end of the day, and it's been a wonderful day. Before I turn to some closing comments, I'll just turn back to our afternoon panel here and see if any of you would like to offer any thoughts that have come to you during our afternoon session, or touch on anything that has come to mind as we've been carrying on the day. And no obligation if you're good. Oh, go ahead, Les.
Sure. I just, it was really interesting, just even in the session here and during the presentations that I heard, there's a lot of common ground here. That even if you just pick those out and move forward from there, I think that's many years of goals and objectives that could be established, and moving forward with the heart of the Fraser, and then expanding beyond eventually. But I think it's there. The pieces are there, and what I hear, the goodwill's there, is just need someone to pull it together. So be organization, not working individually in these places. So anyways, that's my closing comment on that.
Great, thanks, Les. I'll just go around the square and feel free to say no thanks if you don't have anything to add. But Scott, you're next on my screen anyway.
Okay. Well, I agree with Les. I think there's a lot of common ground here and a lot of shared objectives, and I think pulling that together more precisely, I think, would be beneficial. I will go back to my earlier, I guess, slide suggesting that we do have to find a way to pull together the First Nations perspective on this. And again, I think the LFFA are leading the way for us in that respect. And I guess the other thing I would say is I think it's okay to start small, to start with some things that we can do in the short term that we can afford in terms of resourcing and so on, and then build over time and develop some and really figure out, learn the gaps as we go.
Thanks, Scott. Bruce, comments from you?
I've probably made enough comments to be dangerous today, but I guess I'd go beyond what Scott said, only to add, and what Les said, only to add that I'd encourage everyone to be receptive to invitations if and when they come. It's easy to respond with a concern that a discussion might not be the best use of our time, or our worry about that we might have authorities or rights that we're worried we might be giving up. But I certainly try to put those aside and allow space for the discussion to see if there's a way to move forward in a coordinated and broad manner. And I'm trying to be open to those discussions and seeing great progress at this Heart of the Fraser discussion group. I agree with Les that that starting small, and with Scott, and growing bigger might help us understand where some of the challenges and opportunities lie. But it's going to start with a willingness to engage. And if we see a challenge to engaging, coming up with a solution for how to get past that challenge, rather than expecting the person sending the invite to find their own way around it. We need to find ways and willingness to engage with each other and share that onus. I'll stop there.
Well, thanks, Bruce. I think that's a positive way to look at things, and I think I hope people will take you up on that. Lena, comments from you?
Yeah, sure. Well, this has definitely been a good start. I don't think we have to start. We have already started, so I'm definitely looking forward to next steps. Either Scott or Bruce, one of our government bureaucratic friends, said something about transcending boundaries, and I'm very curious to see how that plays out, because I do agree that's something we need to do. But sometimes there's so many challenges from the government side of things. So definitely I'm curious about that. And I do take to heart some of the echoes of proactivity. So if we can proactively plan and implement rather than wait for continued disasters and chaos, that would be wonderful. So I think we're all pulling in that same direction that someone mentioned earlier, and we just need to keep moving forward.
Wonderful and positive as always from you, Lena. Thank you. Justine.
I think I would just echo what everyone else has said. There does seem to be a general agreement that this area is needing to be protected and a willingness to move forward. And I think that this group has identified themselves as willing to take the risk that's needed to start moving that forward. And so hopefully we have the positive reception from everyone else to be able to continue with that, and we can all work together. Thank you everyone for joining us today. It was a really amazing session, and I'm excited to see where we go with it.